Welcome to Norse Mythology, the unofficial guide. It's unofficial because I'm neither a credentialed academic nor a time-traveling medieval Norse pagan, but I deal with this material directly from the sources, interpreted through the lens of the experts and their opinions. If you're looking for depth and detail in a simple and accessible way, then you're in the right place.
At 8, sin skal hver døye, en engi må, unden komast at døye sin. Thought mitt råd, at hver flyum hvergi og germ av våri hendi sem hrøstiligast. At one time shall every man die, and no one may escape their death. It is my counsel that we flee not, but do the work of our hands at our boldest. If this wasn't already completely obvious, the current year is 2023 and I'm an American. In my context, whenever I have a question about history, I can turn to books and the internet. When I was younger, I sat in history classes in school and learned all about things that happened in the world ever since the beginning of the human species on down to the present day. There are professionals out there in the world who study and record history for a living. Sometimes they argue with each other and debate the finer points about whether or not so-and-so ever actually said some famous quote or what all the factors were that resulted in a war somewhere. But even if we aren't certain about all of the details, there's a lot of things we are certain enough about because of the vast amount of information that was written down and still survives. We know, for example, exactly what day Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and exactly what date the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We know who the Emperor of Japan was at the time, who the President of the United States was, who the Queen of England was, and how lots of other countries factored into the story, and we also know that these things happened after the invention of manned flight, but before the invention of manned space travel. The timeline and historical context is super clear. But let's change the story just a little bit. Let's say that it's still 2023 and I'm still an American, but this time there is no internet and no written history, no phones, no TV, and no radio. There are only oral memories passed down from generation to generation about important things that have happened in the past. Tonight, as I get settled into my bed, ready to fall asleep, I ask my grandmother to tell me a story, and she decides to relate a few such memories. Back in the old days, she says, there was a man named George who was king of a country called England far across the sea, and he sent many people across that sea to this land, which was new at the time. He knew that this land was wide and fertile, and most of it had never been explored, and he hoped to enrich himself off of the land's natural resources. The first man to arrive by ship on this new land was named Christopher Columbus, and he named it America after his grandfather, Amerigo Vespucci, who had been lord over a small region in Italy. Now, Columbus was an enterprising man and loyal to the king, and he realized that much more money could be made by enslaving the barbarians that inhabited the land before the Englanders arrived. When he ran out of indigenous barbarians to enslave, he began having slaves shipped over from Africa as well. And so, for many years, America became prosperous and transferred its wealth back to the King of England in the form of taxes. But there was one local lord whose name was George Washington, who didn't want to pay taxes to a king that lived in a faraway place all the way across the ocean. It was said that Washington was so honorable he could never tell a lie, having once chopped down his father's prized cherry tree when he was only 6 years old, and then readily admitted his guilt, which caused his father to forget his anger and rejoice in his son's honesty. Washington also believed that every man had the right to be free, so he began secretly forming an army. He made alliances with other American lords, such as Benjamin Franklin and Abraham Lincoln. Washington's army needed to cross the Delaware River to attack the army of King George, but he didn't have enough troops, and he was worried his men would be attacked while on the water. Also, it was wintertime, and the river was full of ice, making it difficult to navigate. But Benjamin Franklin had an idea. He flew a kite in a thunderstorm, with a key tied to the kite string, and when the kite was struck by lightning, the key glowed. Franklin realized he could harness this power to help Washington's army, so he outfitted them all with special lanterns powered by these glowing lightning keys, and some special glasses he invented that would allow them to see more clearly than other men. Meanwhile, Abraham Lincoln took a contingent of troops and attacked Columbus's manor in the south.
Lincoln slew Columbus and his general, a man named Lee, and freed all the American slaves, thus allowing them to join Washington's army. With the help of the newly freed slaves, and the special glasses and the lanterns, Washington's army was able to see in the dark and navigate across the icy Delaware River by night. Washington attacked King George's army while they slept, and as a result, Washington defeated King George. The American people wanted Washington to be their new king, but he believed America should be a country without kings, so he established a system where every 4 years the people can vote for a new leader. The end. Now go to sleep. So, the historical problems with this story are obvious and numerous. It treats real historical characters who actually lived hundreds of years apart from each other as though they knew each other. It misinterprets Christopher Columbus's nationality as English. It treats fake folktales as fact. It misrepresents technological inventions. It contains subtle but uncomfortable racial undertones. It conflates 2 different American wars. I could probably go on for a while. But the people it mentions did live in history. There was a war wherein the United States gained independence from England, and another one involving Abraham Lincoln's abolishment of slavery. The story is based on real things, but because nobody has access to recorded history in this thought experiment, my grandmother doesn't know how long ago any of these things took place, or how events really transpired, and there's no one around to question the truthfulness of her account. In fact, in this environment, it's entirely possible that one day I could meet a nice young lady who tells me she's the daughter of George Washington, but was hidden away by her uncle who was concerned for her safety after Washington's death, and this is why she now lives with a poor family in the woods. And if she can solve a couple of riddles for me, I might totally accept this story as absolute fact. If it can't be disproven, why not? And if it's good enough for Ragnar Lothbrok, then it's good enough for me. But we'll get to that another time. For now, let's talk a little bit about Norse legends that take place in the migration period. The point I'm really going to be hammering home here is that when an Icelandic grandmother living in 900 AD tells her grandchildren the story of some legendary hero who might have been a king of the Franks born in 535 AD, interacting with Attila the Hun, who historically died a century earlier, she very likely has no idea how far removed in time she is from when these characters lived, or how her story deviates from actual history, or even that neither of these characters are actually Norse. Both of them, as we'll see as we get into things here, are treated as part of a close enough pan-Germanic, back in the old days these guys were all famous and lived within accessible distances, milieu that is almost entirely devoid of ethnic, religious, and cultural differences that may have existed in real life among the various groups mentioned in the story. In reality, the migration period is a time in European history typically thought of as having begun around 375 AD with the Huns' invasion of Europe. To sort of oversimplify things, you have these very successful invaders coming in from the east, and people start getting displaced and moving around. Some historians will tell you this period ends with the Lombards conquering Italy in 568, and some will even stretch it out to around 800, right as the Viking Age is kicking off. But it's during this time that the Anglo-Saxons migrate from the continent into England, the Western Roman Empire falls, the Ostrogoths end up in Spain, and the Vandals end up in northern Africa. In Scandinavia, people are speaking various dialects of Proto-Norse and writing with Elder Futhark. It's also during this time that something happens, or probably more accurately, many things happen, that will inspire the incredible saga of the Volsungs. It's a back-in-the-old-days story, already by the Norse period, but it's also a story that gets remembered outside of Scandinavia. Around 1200 AD, an epic poem will be written in Middle High German called the Nibelungenlied, recounting remarkably similar events taking place among characters with remarkably similar names as those we find in the Norse Saga. And some of the earliest characters in the story will also be mentioned in the most famous of all Old English poems, Beowulf. As with so many things we talk about on this show, the saga may be a Norse story, but the legend inspiring the story is a broader, more pan-Germanic one. And the story begins like this. Back in the old days, there were 2 men named Siggi and Skadi. Yes, that's right, a man with the same name as the goddess Skadi.
Skadi the man was also a powerful and imposing fellow, but as it turns out, Siggi actually had a higher status than Skadi, because his father just so happened to be Odin, and it's hard to come by a better lineage than that. Well, as it happened, Siggi, son of Odin, decided one day to go out hunting with Skadi's slave. The saga uses the word thrall, who is a man by the name of Brethi. Regardless of the fact that Brethi was a slave and thus had pretty much the lowest status imaginable, he somehow actually managed to be pretty smart and talented at things. He was even as skilled or more skilled at certain things than some other people with a higher social status. Your suspension of disbelief is already strained, I know, but that's how the story goes. So, how exactly Siggi ends up out on a hunting trip with Skadi's slave, rather than, say, his own slave or something, isn't explained. But what ends up happening after a very long day of hunting is that Brethi the slave has actually bagged better game than Siggi, son of Odin. Well, Siggi can't allow that sort of an embarrassment, of course, so he kills Brethi. But rather than owning up to what he's done, which is what you would need to do in later Norse Iceland in order to handle the situation appropriately and not be labeled a murderer, he hides Brethi's body by burying it in a snowdrift. He then heads home and announces to Skadi that Brethi ran away on a horse and escaped off through the forest to who knows where. But Skadi seems to be getting a weird vibe off of Siggi, and starts to suspect that there's some deception going on here. And if Siggi is being deceitful about why Brethi hasn't come back home, then the most likely explanation is that Siggi has probably killed him. So Skadi organizes a search party to go out looking for Brethi, and what do you know, they find his murdered corpse buried in a snowdrift. And this, according to the narrator, is why any large snowdrift is called a waelhraefn in Old Norse. Now, as I mentioned, because Siggi committed this killing in stealth and didn't announce publicly what he'd done, it gets labeled murder. The Old Norse word is actually myrða, and had he announced it, it would have been something more like manslaughter, and he could have resolved it by paying Skadi some money. But in this case, Siggi tries to be sneaky, so he gets labeled a murderer and declared an outlaw. You may remember this concept from episode 10, when we talked about Fenrir and the symbolic purpose of wolves in Norse society. Siggi gets branded with the outlaw term vargur, which means wolf, and more specifically, he is declared, quote, a wolf in hallowed places, end quote, and has to leave. But Siggi is Odin's son, and Odin doesn't want to leave him just completely high and dry, so he guides Siggi out of whatever land this story begins in on a remarkably long journey. And after traveling for a very long time, they come to a place where some warships are just chilling out by the shore. The way the saga reads, it sounds like Odin maybe sort of places Siggi in charge of whatever men were already hanging around these warships somehow, but in some way, he gives Siggi some troops to lead here and then takes off, leaving Siggi and his men to subsist for themselves by raiding. Turns out they're pretty good at what they do, and after a while, they end up seizing an entire kingdom to rule, specifically the kingdom of Hunland, because the Huns were remembered in Norse legend as pretty much just another Germanic people. But now we have our first location for where this story is actually taking place, and it is somewhere deep in the heart of continental Europe. But whereas the saga calls this area Hunland, the prologue to the Prose Edda actually tells us that Siggi was king over a place called Frankland, or in other words, the land of the Franks. There's some more support for the Frankland idea in the Poetic Edda as well, but for now, we'll be going off the story as told in the saga. In either case, we're ostensibly in Germanic territory somewhere south of Denmark. While ruling over Frankland or Hunland or whatever, Siggi decides to take a wife, and is able to obtain for himself a, quote, noble match. The wife isn't named, and neither is her origin, but she bears Siggi a son named Rerir, who grows up alongside his father to become big, strong, and able. That's a good thing, too, because he's gonna need all the strength and ability he can get. As Siggi advances into old age, he finds himself surrounded by envious rivals, including his wife's own brothers. And in the least amount of detail the narrator can possibly muster, his envious brothers-in-law find a moment when they can catch Siggi unawares without too large a retinue alongside him, and they attack, killing Siggi and all of the men who are with him, which does not include his big, strong son Rerir, who for whatever reason was not present at the moment of the attack. Rerir, of course, is not going to allow his father's murder to go unavenged, so he gathers up a large force of his friends and various local chieftains and smashes his way back into the kingship that rightfully belonged to him. At this point, he needs to deal with his treacherous uncles. Normally, you wouldn't go to war against your own kin. In fact, such an idea would be considered appalling. But in this case, Rerir is sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. He can either go to war against his uncles or leave his father unavenged. In this case, he ultimately decides that his uncles have already done so much damage to him that those kinship bonds are effectively severed, and he leads his army against them and doesn't stop until he's slain every single one of them. This, of course, makes Rerir an even more powerful king than even his father was, because he's able to take over the land and the wealth and the power of each of his maternal uncles. With all this wealth and influence, Rerir is able to have his pick of the available women, and he marries another unnamed woman who he considers to be the most suitable match. But although they try for a very long time, they find themselves completely unable to have any kids, which makes them both pretty sad. They begin fervently supplicating the gods for help in getting pregnant, and eventually their prayers are heard by Frigg, who is, of course, the wife of Odin, and technically Rerir's grandmother. Frigg carries their request to Odin, who is perfectly happy to help out in this situation. He calls for someone called an Oskmar, which means wish maiden, and he gives her a magic apple, which she is instructed to take to his grandson King Rerir. Now, wish maiden is not a very common word in the sources, and we don't see it being used anywhere else I'm aware of to refer to some kind of woman that serves Odin. However, if we assume that maybe this is just a small mistake, and the word was actually supposed to be Oskamar, suddenly it means something more like chosen or adopted maiden, something more like a stepdaughter. In this case, it very likely refers to a Valkyrie, since Valkyries were, after all, Odin's chosen maidens. This particular maiden is named Hljóð, and she is the daughter of a Jotun named Hrimnir. Hljóð takes the apple from Odin, turns herself into the shape of a crow, and flies off to find Rerir sitting on a mound where she drops the apple into his lap. Suspecting that a crow dropping an apple into his lap probably has some divine meaning behind it, Rerir heads home to, quote, meet with the queen, end quote, and during that little visit, either he or she eats some of the apple. It's actually not super clear which one of them does the eating here, though. The grammar seems to favor the king eating the apple, but it does make a little more sense for the queen to be doing it, given what happens next. Either way, this apple works its magic, and soon the queen realizes she is pregnant with a child. But her pregnancy goes on much longer than it's supposed to, and during this time of extended pregnancy, Rerir has to go off on some kind of a military campaign as kings typically do. But while on that journey, he, quote, took sick, then died, and intended to go home to Odin, end quote, which the narrator reminds us was a desirable thing for a lot of people back in those days. I'll point out here as well that this is one of those fascinating little moments we talked about in episode 11, where it looks like we have a character dying of sickness and apparently still achieving a spot in Valhall. Could it be because Rerir was a king who had dedicated himself to Odin at some point? Did he perhaps mark himself with a spear upon his deathbed? We'll probably never know. In any case, back home, the queen's pregnancy continues on for a total of 6 years. And at this point, it finally starts to set in that she's probably not going to survive much longer, and she requests to have the baby cut out of her, and the request is granted. The baby turns out to be a boy, except he's not a baby at all, since he's been maturing in the womb for 6 years, and as his mother is fading there on the operating table, he even gives her a kiss before she finally dies from the whole ordeal. Well, this boy is named Volsung, and he inherits the kingdom of Hunland, or Frackland if you prefer the Prose Edda, from his father. Volsung is a classic Norse hero, which means he too is big and strong and daring and great at all the manliest stuff. Unsurprisingly, he becomes the greatest of all warriors and is victorious in all his battles, all before he's even fully grown. When he finally is fully grown, Hrimnir the Jotun sends him his daughter Hljóð, who was the wish maiden, or Valkyrie, that gave Rerir the magic apple, and Volsung marries her. Finally, a wife with a name. Their relationship goes really well, and they end up having 10 sons and 1 daughter, the eldest of whom is a boy they named Sigmund, and the daughter, who actually happens to be Sigmund's twin sister, is named Signy. We can only imagine that the other 9 boys might have all had names prefixed with Sig as well. Sigr is an Old Norse word that means victory, and even Odin himself can be referred to as Sigtyr, or victory god. But it's worth pointing out now that not only do we suddenly have more unnamed males than females in this story, but Sigmund and Signy are great-grandchildren of Odin, but they are also at least a quarter Jotun. We don't know who Hljóð's mother was, so we can't know for sure if they are fully half Jotun, but the supernatural lineage is piling up in this family. So Sigmund and his sister Signy are super ugly and terrible at everything. Just kidding. This is a Norse saga, so once again, these two are the finest looking and best of all of Volsungs' children, even in light of the fact that the other 9 are all imposing boys in their own right. In fact, the narrator reminds us here that generally Volsungs' descendants have been exceptionally ambitious. They even surpassed other saga heroes both in their accomplishments and in raw desire to win. Basically, the narrator tells us you should keep in mind that these characters are the best saga characters. Anyway, King Volsung has an amazing palace built, but it has a very particular feature. You see, the hall is actually built around the trunk of a huge tree, as in, the tree comes up through the floor and goes out through the roof. It's referred to in the story here as an oak, but Icelanders had a bad habit of using the word oak as a general term for any tree, sort of like how in some parts of the American Southeast you can actually refer to any kind of carbonated drink as a Coke. In fact, a little later it gets referred to as an apple tree, but here again, this tends to be used as a more general word for just a tree sometimes. So who knows what kind of tree this literally was. But the tree's name is barnstokkr, which very literally means child trunk. There's been some scholarly discussion about whether or not this is the original name for the tree, and as you might expect, how it might be connected to the idea of Yggdrasil, and or of the tree associated with Valhall. But let's not derail the story with too much speculation. Enter the character Siggeir, Victory Spear, who is a powerful king ruling over Gautland, which is an area in southern modern-day Sweden. Also, despite the name, he does not appear to be related to King Volsung and his family, who, you'll recall, are currently living somewhere in continental Europe that the story keeps calling Hunland. King Siggeir pays a visit to King Volsung to ask for his daughter Signy's hand in marriage, and Volsung thinks this sounds like a great idea, and so do his sons, as if their opinions matter. But Signy does not think this sounds like a great idea. But being the dutiful daughter that she is, she leaves the decision up to her father, and Volsung agrees to the betrothal. The wedding and associated banquet are then planned to take place at Volsung's palace. So super rich King Volsung, of course, spares no expense in making this an elaborate occasion, and King Siggeir shows up with his royal retinue on the appointed day. Large fires are kindled in long hearths running all the way down the length of Volsung's hall, and shining in all that gorgeous firelight is this imposing tree growing up right through the center of it. So as the festivities get underway, everybody's hanging out, feasting in the hall, having a great time, when suddenly the doors fly open, and in walks a stranger from the outside. I imagine this as one of those scenes where everyone immediately goes silent and turns to stare at this new mysterious guest. He's an old man, tall but gray with age, walking barefoot with linen breeches tied around his legs and a mottled, hooded cape. The hood hangs low over his head, but beneath that hood, the guests can see that the man's face sports only a single eye. As if oblivious to the tension and the silence in the room, the old man makes his way slowly to the tree Barnstokkr while brandishing a sword. Upon reaching it, he suddenly lifts the sword and with a single thrust jams it into the trunk of the tree all the way down to the hilt. He turns his gaze upon the speechless crowd, and seeing that words have failed everyone in the room, he opens his own mouth to announce his reason for coming. Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone and anvil is right wise king born of all England. Oh, sorry. That's actually from King Arthur and His Knights by Thomas Mallory. Let me try that again. He who draws this sword from this stock shall have it from me as a gift, and he himself shall realize in truth that he has never borne a better sword in his hand than this. Then, with the crowd still gawking in silence, the old man walks out of the hall without ever explaining who he was or where he was going. Now, you and I, the audience of this story, are meant to understand that this is Odin. The narrator has done everything but spell out his name for us. But the crowd at the wedding is somehow completely oblivious, even though this is exactly the way Odin always shows up in every story. But suddenly there's this moment where everyone starts looking at each other and then back at this really nice-looking sword stuck in the tree, and I imagine the silence is just shattered as everyone starts clamoring to be the first one to go up and try to pull it out. But ultimately, it's worked out that this should be done in an orderly fashion, or in other words, by order of rank and status. The noblest men are allowed to come up first and try to pull the sword out before the others, but nobody is able to make the thing budge at all, no matter which way they try pulling on it. Finally, Sigmund, son of Volsung and twin brother of Signy the bride, comes forward to try his hand at drawing the sword in the stone. The sword in the tree trunk. He approaches, wraps his fingers around the hilt, and effortlessly slides it right out of the tree as if it had been sitting loosely in place all along. And now, with the blade fully revealed, everyone starts looking at this thing in awe and agreeing that what the old man said was true. No one had ever seen such a fine sword. And it's at this point when the troubles begin. King Siggeir, the groom, offers to buy the sword from Sigmund for triple its weight in gold, but Sigmund responds by telling him, "Hey, you could have pulled this sword out just as easily as me if it had been meant for you, but you didn't, because it wasn't. You could offer me all the gold you own, and I still wouldn't sell it to you." Now, Siggeir doesn't take too kindly to Sigmund's reply. In fact, he considers it a little insulting, and he starts getting pretty angry about it, inwardly. He's also a bit of an underhanded and deceitful man, so in the moment, he pretends to let the matter go. But that evening, he starts planning his revenge. King Siggeir spends his wedding night with Signy as expected, and then, because the weather happens to be good the next day, he makes it known that he really ought to be returning home before the weather starts to get bad. And this strikes everyone as a little weird, because they'd come all this way from Sweden for what ought to have been a multi-day celebration. But Volsung is basically just like, okay, I guess, if that's what you want. But Signy finds a private moment to speak with her father, and tells him that she really doesn't want to go away with Siggeir. She tells him basically, "Dad, I have a bad feeling about this. As you know, and as the audience is just now finding out, I have the gift of foresight, and I also deal with our family's guardian spirit, and I've discovered by those means that if we don't dissolve this marriage contract right away, this whole thing is going to bring all of us a lot of misery." "And as you know," Volsung replies, "it would be shameful to break our agreement without cause. We'd lose Siggeir's trust and any hope of having him as an ally. He'd repay us with as much malice as he could muster up. I get that you're telling me bad things are on the horizon if we don't break the agreement, but what I'm saying is that bad things are also on the horizon if we do. So the only honorable thing to do in that case is keep our side of the bargain." So Siggeir starts getting his ships ready to head home, but before he leaves, he has a little chat with Volsung, and he says, "Hey, I know it's weird that I'm dipping out of the celebration early, but I'd like to make it up to you. Why don't you and your sons come and visit us in Gautland in 3 months? You can bring as many men as you feel is fitting for a king of your station, and I'll host all of them." Volsung agrees, and Siggeir travels back to Gautland with his new bride, Signy. Nothing noteworthy happens over the next 3 months, so when the appointed time comes, Volsung takes his sons and however many men he thinks make sense, and they all set off towards Gautland in 3 ships. The voyage goes well, and they arrive on time, late in the evening. Signy heads out to greet them alone and has a private chat with her father and brothers, warning them that they are heading into a trap. It turns out that King Siggeir has already put together a strong army and plans to betray them. Signy advises her father to head back home and gather up the strongest army he can and then come back to avenge this attempted treachery. Otherwise, he's not going to get out of this situation alive. And now,
Everything I've been telling you about fate and manliness over the course of this whole show comes into play when Volsung replies with the following quote. All peoples will remember that I spake a word while still unborn, and made a vow that I would flee in fear from neither fire nor iron, and so have I done until now, and why would I not fulfill that in my old age? Maidens will not mock my sons during games by accusing them of fearing their deaths, for at one time shall every man die, and no one may escape their death. It is my counsel that we flee not, but do the work of our hands at our boldest. I have fought 100 times, sometimes with the larger army and sometimes with the smaller one. I have always been victorious either way, and it will not be told that I fled or begged for peace." End quote. Realizing that her father is about to die, Signy starts crying and asks him not to make her go back home to her husband. But Volsung is a man's man. He's all about doing things the right and proper way, so he tells Signy that she does indeed have to go back to King Siggeir no matter what happens. Volsung and his men camp there by the shore that night, and in the morning they begin preparing for battle. It's not long before Siggeir shows up with his army, just as Signy warned he would, and the fight commences. The battle is described as the hardest of battles, with King Volsung and his sons being able to break through the ranks of Siggeir's army a total of 8 times before the overwhelming force of Siggeir's sheer numbers just get the better of them, and Volsung is finally killed. In fact, all of Volsung's men are killed except for his 10 sons, who are all taken away as captives. When Signy learns about this, she realizes that her brothers are eventually going to be executed, so she approaches her husband in private and makes a really weird request. "Is there any way," she asks, "that instead of killing my brothers quickly, you could put them in stocks and then maybe let them starve to death or get eaten slowly by wild animals or something? I'd just really prefer to be able to see them a while longer." Siggeir, of course, is like, "You're insane, but if you want them to die a slower, more torturous death, then yeah, I'm game for that." And so the brothers are taken out to the woods, and a great big piece of wood is made into stocks that are clamped onto all of their feet, and they're all just left there, stuck in the woods to die. They sit there all day until night falls, and then at midnight, a big, grim-looking she-wolf discovers them. Being bound and unable to defend themselves, the wolf eats one of the brothers. She gets full and then goes away. In the morning, Signy sends one of her trusted men out to the woods to see how her brothers are doing, and gets word back that one of them has already been eaten by a wolf. So she's like, well, crap. This, of course, is not exactly what Signy had planned, and she also can't help at the moment, so she's forced to sit idly by over the course of the next 8 nights, as that same wolf returns every night and eats another one of her brothers. Finally, the only one remaining is her twin, the eldest of Volsung's sons, Sigmund. Sigmund is Signy's last hope, and she can't have him dying, so she finally comes up with an idea. She tells that same trusted servant of hers to take some honey out into the forest and smear that honey all over Sigmund's face, and make doubly sure that he really gets a bunch of it smeared into Sigmund's mouth. The servant complies, and leaves Sigmund sitting there as evening begins to fall, all alone in the woods next to the mangled remains of his 9 dead brothers, with honey smeared all over his face. Just as before, the wolf returns for her nightly meal, but this time she's greeted by a special sweet-smelling treat. Curious, she approaches Sigmund, sniffing out the source of the honey, and then starts licking it off of his face. Realizing that he's been holding some of that honey in his mouth, the wolf jams her tongue into Sigmund's mouth to get at it, but when she does, he bites down on it as hard as he can. The wolf freaks out and jerks backwards so hard that she breaks the stocks that are holding Sigmund captive. But Sigmund is biting down so hard on the wolf's tongue that it gets torn out from the wolf's mouth in the process, and she bleeds to death, leaving him freed from his imprisonment. At this point, the author interjects a fun fact, that some men say that the wolf was actually King Siggeir's mother, who had shapeshifted into a wolf by means of witchcraft. The literal translation here is actually more like trollcraft, and her knowledge of sorcery. We don't have any more information on why people would have thought this, but this won't be the last time the idea of somebody's evil magic mother shows up in the story. The next morning, Signy sends her servants out to the woods again and learns that Sigmund has indeed been able to free himself, and she heads out into the woods herself to meet with him and to begin plotting revenge against her husband. They decide that Sigmund should make himself a secret underground dwelling. The word is actually jarðhús, or earth house, out in the woods, and every so often, Signy will bring him whatever provisions he might need that he can't get for himself. And this is how things go on for a while, with King Siggeir oblivious to the fact that one of the Volsung boys is still alive. Now, when I say this is how things go for a while, I mean a while. During this time, Signy and her evil husband king have 2 sons, and when the oldest of the 2 turns 10 years old, she sends him out into the woods to meet with his uncle Sigmund and to find out if Sigmund can make use of him in their revenge plot. The boy arrives at Sigmund's earth house late in the evening, and Sigmund greets him well. They're going to need to work together on some things, so Sigmund tells the boy to start making some bread, while Sigmund himself goes out to look for some firewood. Sigmund gives the boy a sack of flour and leaves the house, but when he returns with the firewood, he finds that the boy hasn't even gotten started on the bread. "Why didn't you make any bread?" Sigmund asks, and the boy responds that there seemed to be something alive and moving in that sack of flour, and that was just too creepy, and he didn't dare touch it. Well, this kid ain't gonna work, I imagine Sigmund must have thought to himself at this moment, and the next time he meets with his sister Signy, he explains that the boy is too much of a scaredy cat to be any kind of a useful companion. "All right, well, you might as well just go ahead and kill him then," Signy replies. "If he's no use to us, then there's really no reason he needs to go on living." And so that's what Sigmund does. Winter passes, and another whole year goes by until the next winter begins to set in, and at this point, Signy decides to send her younger son to meet with Sigmund and see if he can perform any better than his cowardly big brother. Unfortunately, the exact same thing happens as before, and the younger son ends up dead at Sigmund's hand at Signy's bidding. What isn't being spelled out explicitly by the narrative here, but what we are intended to understand as the audience, is that the problem with Signy's 2 sons is actually the cowardly nature of their father. Siggeir is a less true and brave man than Sigmund, so he produces weak heirs. Signy appears particularly harsh and cruel here, advocating for the deaths of her own children, but Signy's situation is also complex. She's trapped in a marriage she doesn't want to be in, being forced or at least heavily pressured by all of society around her to bear children to a man she doesn't want. These children, to her, are just a means to an end, and when they exhibit a cowardly nature, surely all she can see in them is the reflection of their father. Her actions here are still not particularly nice, and maybe the ancient audiences of this story were meant to be at least a little horrified by what's going on here as well. But the plot conflict that needs to be overcome here is that it looks like Siggeir can't produce offspring that are stout-hearted enough to assist in murdering their own father, and Signy now needs to find a way around this. So one day, Signy is sitting in her chamber and receives a visit from a seidkona, a woman who practices seidr magic, or in other words, a sorceress. And Signy says to the seidkona, "I need you to use your magic to swap appearances with me," and the seidkona obliges. This will also not be the last time we see some Freaky Friday-type antics occur in this story. But King Siggeir spends the night with the seidkona, thinking that she's his wife, while Signy sneaks off to her brother Sigmund's earth house in the woods. She knocks on the door and explains that she's just a poor little old sorceress who's lost her way out in the forest and needs a place to stay for the night. Sigmund agrees to this because, 1, it wouldn't be right to refuse shelter to a poor lost woman, and 2, he thinks she's pretty hot. In fact, he can't stop stealing little glances at her all evening long. And we know how these Norse heroes have the smoothest pickup lines, so after they finish eating dinner, he, quote, told her that he wanted them to share one bed that night. She doesn't object to this, and actually ends up hanging around in Sigmund's bed for 3 nights in a row, after which she returns home, meets up with the actual seidkona, and exchanges physical appearances with her again. So, a few months after this horrifying little event, Signy gives birth to a son, who receives the name Sinfjotli. Being of 100% pure Volsunga stock, he is the great-great-grandson of Odin and is at least a quarter Jotun, so as we might expect, he grows up to be big and strong and handsome just like all the other members of his family. When he's not quite 10 years old, Signy sends him off to meet with Sigmund, just as she tried with her previous 2 sons. So keep in mind,
This revenge plot has now been brewing for over 21 years, with Sigmund living like some weird hermit in an earth house out in the Swedish forests for all that time. Now, what the narrator had forgotten to mention until now was that before sending her prior two sons to meet with Sigmund, Signy had actually given each of them a manliness test of her own. At some point, she had sewn the cuffs of their sleeves straight into the skin of their hands, passing a needle deep into the flesh, whereupon each of them reacted, quote, poorly, and cried out in pain. Not a good omen for what was to come, but when Signy now tries the same trick on Sinfjotli, he doesn't flinch at all. Rather, he just rips the whole thing off of himself, taking some of the skin with it. When Signy asks whether or not what he just did was painful, he answers, psh, that kind of pain wouldn't have bothered Volsung. Clearly, there has been a very strong pro-Volsung narrative happening behind closed doors here. So anyway, Sinfjotli ends up at his uncle father Sigmund's earth house and is given the same task of making bread that Sigmund gave the other two boys while he heads out to collect firewood. This time, when Sigmund comes home, the baking has been completed. So, how was that flour I gave you? He asks when he gets back inside. Well, Sinfjotli replies, I suspect there may have been something alive in there, but whatever it was, it got mashed and kneaded into the dough. Sigmund finds this hilarious and starts laughing, and then says, okay, well, in that case, you probably shouldn't eat that bread, because you just cooked the most poisonous snake I could find into it. You see, as it turns out, Sigmund is actually so tough that he can eat any kind of poison without being affected at all. But this isn't exactly normal, and Sinfjotli isn't immune to any poison that he eats or drinks. He's only immune to external poisons. Now, at this point, Sigmund thinks Sinfjotli is great, but still doesn't realize he's his own son. He also thinks that 10 is a bit young to be enacting his grand revenge plans, and he wants to make sure Sinfjotli is fully toughened up first. So during the next few summers, they spend their time wandering through the forest and killing random men for their possessions. All the while, Sinfjotli is constantly reminding Sigmund about his grievances and almost begging to go get this revenge plot started. And Sigmund is thinking to himself like, man, this kid sure acts a lot like a Volsung, but he must really take after his mom. It's super weird how excited he is about killing his own dad. I guess he must be some kind of unholy union between the fierceness of the Volsungs and the evilness of Siggeir. That could turn into a problem later. So this one time, the two of them are wandering through the forest looking for stuff to steal or people to kill or whatever, and they come across a house with two sleeping men inside that each have a very expensive-looking thick gold ring, probably arm rings. As it turns out, these two guys are the sons of kings, and they also happen to be cursed. Hanging above them in the house, just like regular articles of clothing, are two wolf skins, two ulvahamir. It's the same grammatical construction as the bird skins worn by Valkyries and goddesses, and apparently, whoever puts on one of these wolf skins will turn into a wolf, and will only be able to take the wolf skin back off every 10 days. By the way, are you seeing all the not-so-subtle references to 9 everywhere in this story? Every 10 days is just another way of saying after 9 nights. 9 brothers get eaten by a wolf, all of Signy's sons meet with Volsung when they're 10, meaning after the completion of 9 years. It's literally everywhere. Anyway, Sigmund and Sinfjotli don't know these wolf skins are cursed, only the narrator does. So they put them on and immediately transform into wolves, presumably freeing these 2 other princes from the curse. Or maybe they already killed those 2 guys, it's not exactly clear. But when Sigmund and Sinfjotli transform into wolves, they start howling and discover that they can actually still understand each other. And even though their communication hasn't been impeded at all, and even though wolves are pack animals, they decide to immediately part ways. Not permanently, though. It reads like they just want to go try out their new wolf powers on some unsuspecting groups of people. They even make a deal that they won't get into any fights with any groups of more than 7 men. If either one of them does happen to get attacked by a group of more than 7, he's supposed to howl for the other one to come help. But Sigmund knows that Sinfjotli is young and daring, so after they make this agreement, he follows it up with a line that's like, no, but seriously though, like for real, don't break this agreement because I know you're going to want to and people are going to be hunting you. So the 2 wolves each go their own way, and immediately Sigmund encounters a group of exactly 7 men.
He howls as per the agreement, and Sinfjotli shows up to help, and kills all of them. They part ways again, and almost immediately Sinfjotli encounters a group of 11 men. But just as Sigmund suspected, he doesn't howl for help. It's a brutal fight, and Sinfjotli does win, but not without being badly wounded, so he hobbles over to an oak tree to rest until Sigmund happens to come by and find him there. "Why didn't you howl for help?" Sigmund asks, and Sinfjotli replies like a real teenage turd by saying basically, "Ha! Look at you! You accepted help fighting 7 men. I took 11 on my own, and I'm just a child compared to you." Well, Sigmund doesn't like having his valor insulted like this, so he lunges at Sinfjotli and knocks him over and bites him in the neck, which shuts him up pretty effectively. It's at this point that the story seems to allude to the idea that Sigmund finally realizes he can't just come out of the wolf skin whenever he wants to. He somehow finagles Sinfjotli's injured wolf body up onto his shoulders and carries him back to the hut, where he starts cursing the wolf skins and saying things like, "Ah, these skins! May the trolls take them!" It's almost like he's sort of blaming the skins for this predicament, and even though he hasn't outright killed Sinfjotli, he has hurt him pretty bad, and he's not quite sure what to do to help the kid get better. But one day he's maybe looking out a window or something like that, but he's watching a couple of weasels messing around in the yard, and he sees one of them bite the other one in the neck. Realizing he's just injured his little weasel buddy, the more aggressive one runs off into the woods and comes back with a leaf, which he lays on his little weasel pal's wound, and right away the injured weasel jumps up completely healed. Seeing this, Sigmund heads outside, and then sees a raven flying overhead carrying a leaf. As the audience, you and I are supposed to understand that when a raven brings you a gift, it's coming from Odin. The raven brings the leaf down to Sigmund, who places it over Sinfjotli's neck wound, and just like the little weasel, Sinfjotli jumps up healed as if he'd never been injured in the first place. After a few days, Sigmund and Sinfjotli are finally able to take off the wolfskins, which you'll recall are only stuck on you for 9 nights. Not being particularly happy about having been cursed to turn into wolves for 9 nights, they immediately throw the skins into a fire and destroy them. Cut to the future, and Sinfjotli is now fully grown, meaning really that he's probably still some kind of maybe a later teenager. Sigmund feels like he's tested Sinfjotli's mettle enough, and it's time to seek vengeance on King Siggeir for his betrayal of King Volsung. The day arrives, probably nearly 30 years after the betrayal at this point. The saga doesn't say this, but in my mind, it's probably been exactly 27 years, because, 9 times 3 and all that. Plus, it would make Sinfjotli exactly the age we would expect him to be here. Anyway, evening falls, and Sigmund and his nephew-son Sinfjotli arrive at Siggeir's estate. They sneak into the outer room in front of the main hall, where they find a bunch of ale casks, and decide to hide themselves here. Queen Signy somehow, quote, found out where they were hiding, and she goes to meet with them, and the 3 decide together to wait until it's fully dark out before enacting their revenge. At this point, Signy has had 2 more kids, who are both very young, and they're currently playing in the hall with toys made of gold, just rolling them around and chasing them as little kids do. King Siggeir is also hanging out in the main hall, doing whatever kingly stuff he has to do in there, and Signy is in there as well. One of the little kids accidentally flings one of his toys out into the outer room, where Sigmund and Sinfjotli are hiding, and he runs after it. And when he does, he notices a couple of big scary guys in helmets and mail hiding among the ale casks there, and he runs in to tattle to his daddy. The king, of course, reacts like, what kind of treachery is this? And when Signy sees this, she scoops up her kids and takes them into the outer room, where she hands them over to her co-conspirators and says, "My kids just betrayed you. You should probably kill them." Sigmund seems to be getting pretty tired of murdering all of his sister's kids, or maybe he doesn't agree that the context really warrants an accusation of betrayal, but either way he's like, oh, okay, no, and he refuses to kill them. Sinfjotli, on the other hand, doesn't bat an eye. He draws his sword, kills both of the little kids, and then actually throws their dead bodies out into the floor of the main hall right in front of King Siggeir, thus ending any chance they might have still had at stealth. Siggeir jumps up with the classic royal, "Guards, seize them!" and his guards rush towards the outer room. Sigmund and Sinfjotli are able to valiantly defend themselves for a good while before they are finally overpowered by Siggeir's onslaught of guards. They're captured, bound, fettered, and sit there immobilized all night long. King Siggeir, for his part, doesn't seem to realize who he's just captured at this point. After all, it's been well over a decade since he's seen Sinfjotli, and well over 20 years since he's seen Sigmund. But we already know that he's a man who likes the idea of long, torturous deaths, so now he tries to cook up the slowest death he can imagine for his two child-murdering captives. In the morning, he has a huge burial mound built out of stones and earth, and he has a giant slab of rock brought in from somewhere that gets dropped into the mound and serves as a kind of a wall dividing the inside of the mound in half. He has Sigmund thrown into the mound and shackled on one side of the wall, and Sinfjotli thrown in and shackled on the other. Then he instructs his slaves to go ahead and cover over the top of the mound, and he leaves. Queen Signy shows up at this point carrying what looks like a nice cut of meat wrapped in some straw, and asks the slaves not to tell the king if she tosses it into the mound. The slaves agree that this probably couldn't hurt, and she tosses it in, where it lands on Sinfjotli's side of the wall. Most things in this story happen at nightfall, so again, when night falls, Sinfjotli calls out to Sigmund on the other side of the wall that they're probably going to be okay on food for a little while, since the queen seems to have tossed in a pretty big cut of meat wrapped in some straw. It's pitch black inside the mound though, so Sinfjotli starts feeling around for this meat with his hands, and what he finds wrapped in the straw is actually Sigmund's sword. Specifically, it's that supernaturally fine sword that started all this trouble decades ago when Sigmund pulled it from the trunk of the tree Barnstalker, and which Sinfjotli recognizes now by feeling the shape of its hilt. Both men are overjoyed at this discovery, and Sinfjotli takes the sword, lifts it up over the top of the rock wall, and pulls it down hard so that it cuts into the slab. Sigmund is then able to grab onto the point of it on the other side, and slowly but surely, the two men are able to saw this huge stone wall in half. They then use the sword to cut off each other's iron shackles, and are able to get free from the mound. In the dead of night, the two of them creep back to the main hall and find everyone asleep. This time, they carry some wood over to the hall and use it to light the place on fire with everyone still inside. When the blaze starts to get going, the fire and smoke wake everybody up, and as the king is trying to figure out who lit the hall on fire, Sigmund busts into the doorway with Sinfjotli and announces, "Here am I with Sinfjotli, my sister's son, and we now want for you to know that not all the Vålsungs are dead." He then turns towards his sister, who is likewise still in the hall, and bids her to come out. I imagine it's sort of like, "Okay, Signy, now's your chance to finally escape. Let's go before I close this place up." But Signy refuses to leave the burning hall. She announces her final confession to everyone within earshot, how she never forgot the slaying of her father, how she had her previous children killed for being too weak to help her achieve vengeance, how she traded shapes with a sorceress and tricked her own brother into getting her pregnant with Sinfjotli in order to produce a son with adequate strength and zeal, how everything she's done for the past almost 30 years was in preparation for this moment. And for all the horrible things she's done, she no longer believes herself worthy to go on living. And so, even though she married King Siggeir reluctantly, she will now choose to die alongside her husband. She approaches her brother and her one remaining son, gives each of them one final goodbye kiss, and then walks back into the fire, where she dies with King Siggeir and all of his retainers. With vengeance finally achieved, Sigmund and Sinfjotli gather together some men and ships and set sail from Gautland back to continental Europe to retake the kingdom of their inheritance. When they arrive in Hunland, they successfully expel some unnamed guy who had set himself up as ruler in Vålsungs' absence, and Sigmund becomes an excellent king, ruling in wisdom and full of ambition. He marries a woman named Borghild, and together they have two sons named Helgi and Hallmundr. When Helgi is born, Norns actually show up to declare for him a destiny wherein he is fated to become the most famous of all kings. And there's more detail about that to be found in the first poem of Helgi Hundingsbani in the Poetic Edda, which we'll get to another time. For now, when Sigmund actually bestows the name Helgi on his firstborn son with his wife, he gifts him a sword, as well as rulership over some place called Solfjol and over Ringsted on the Danish island of Zealand, indicating either that Sigmund's kingdom has become really huge, or that the various legends this saga pulls together might not have fully agreed on all the details about who, what, when, where, and why. Helgi, of course, will grow up to be powerful and well-loved by his subjects, surpassing most other men in skills and accomplishments, first going to war when he's only 15 years old. He will be given command over the troops and will share that command with Sinfjotli, who will join him on various adventures to come. But for now, let's take a break and consider all the ways in which all the things we've talked about on the show so far have played an important role in making this story into what it is. There's the importance of manliness and reputation, the fact that concepts and heroes in Norse mythology aren't exclusive to Scandinavia, the way social status plays into decision-making, the association between wolves and murderous outlawry, the concept of wearing an animal skin that turns you into the shape of that animal, the deceptive feminine nature of Seidr magic, the types of traits inherently shared by pretty much all Norse heroes, Odin's common disguises and his association with ravens, warrior kings being particularly keen on going to Valhall, the unavoidability of fate, trees, the constant repetition of the number 9, and so on and so on and so on and so on. We see it all here in Volsunga Saga. But this isn't nearly the full story, not by a long shot. So if you're still in the mood for more might, magic, and murder, don't forget to tune in next time to Norse Mythology, the Unofficial Guide. Sources for this episode include The Saga of the Volsungs, translated by Jesse Byock, 2004, supplemented by some of my own translations from the source text. The Poetic Edda, translated by Carolyne, Larrington, 2014, and the Prose Edda, translated by Anthony Faulkes, 1995.